deep in the Montana backcountry, a young man stood before an inheritance he never expected to receive. The grandmother he had never known, who had given him up to the state orphanage as an infant, had left him a small, weathered farm. The house was modest, the land stretched toward distant mountains, but it was the barn that commanded his attention. The massive structure loomed at the edge of the property, its doors chained shut with a heavy padlock that had rusted with years of neglect. Nailed to the wood was a hand-written note in faded ink. "For my grandson. Do not open until you are ready to understand why I had to let you go." He stood there, his worn duffel bag at his feet, staring at the locked doors. What secret had his grandmother sealed away in that barn for over 2 decades? And what truth would he uncover that would finally explain why she had abandoned him? At 24 years old, Ethan had left the state orphanage with nothing but a worn duffel bag and a forwarding address that had seemed like a clerical error. A cosmic joke played on someone who had spent his entire life being passed from one temporary situation to another. The lawyer's letter had been formal and brief, explaining that his grandmother, Claire Hayes, a woman whose face he had never seen and whose voice he had never heard, had passed away 6 months prior and left him her property, a small farm in rural Montana. The drive from the city had been long and disorienting, each mile stripping away the familiar urban landscape and replacing it with something vast and untamed. When he finally turned onto the unmarked dirt road that led to the property, the truck bouncing over ruts and stones, he felt as though he were traveling not just through space, but through time itself, moving toward a past that had always been kept carefully hidden from him. The farmhouse appeared first, a modest single-story structure with weathered grey siding and a sagging porch that groaned under his weight. He pushed open the unlocked front door, and the smell of dust and old wood enveloped him. Inside, the house was sparsely furnished, but surprisingly clean, as if someone had been maintaining it even after his grandmother's death. A simple wooden table sat in the kitchen, 2 chairs tucked neatly beneath it. In the living room, a faded floral couch faced a cold stone fireplace. Ethan moved through the rooms like a ghost exploring a life that had nothing to do with him. In what must have been his grandmother's bedroom, he found a neatly made bed, a dresser with a few pieces of simple jewelry, and on the wall, a collection of framed photographs. He studied each one carefully, his heart sinking with each image. There were pictures of a stern-faced woman with graying hair standing alone in front of the farmhouse, photographs of the mountains in different seasons, images of the property from various angles, but nowhere, in any frame, was there a picture of him. No baby photos, no school portraits, no evidence that he had ever existed in her life. The absence was more painful than he had anticipated, a confirmation of what he had always suspected. He had been unwanted, a burden she had rid herself of at the first opportunity. He left the house as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the western peaks, and walked across the property, toward the large barn that stood at the edge of the clearing. The structure was massive, built from dark wood that had weathered to a silver grey, and as he approached, a strange sense of anticipation began to build in his chest. The barn doors were secured with a heavy rusted padlock and thick chains that rattled when he pulled on them. Nailed to the wood, just above the lock, was a piece of paper protected by a plastic sleeve, and on it, written in careful cursive handwriting, were words that stopped him cold. "For my grandson. Do not open until you are ready to understand why I had to let you go." Ethan stood there, reading the note again and again as the shadows lengthened around him. He tried the padlock, pulling and twisting, but it held firm, as immovable as the questions that now filled his mind. He walked the perimeter of the barn, searching for another entrance or a window he might peer through, but the structure was sealed tight, its secrets locked away behind old wood and rusted metal. As darkness settled over the property, Ethan returned to the farmhouse, his mind churning with possibilities and fears. He made a simple meal from the canned goods he found in the pantry, ate in silence at the wooden table, and then lay down on the faded couch, too unsettled to sleep in his grandmother's bed. The note haunted him. Why I had to let you go. Not wanted to, but had to. The distinction felt important, a crack in the wall of rejection he had built around himself over the years. Sleep would not come. Ethan lay on the couch in the darkness, listening to the old farmhouse settle and creak around him, the sounds of wood contracting in the cooling night air like the breathing of some ancient creature. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the note on the barn door, those carefully written words that suggested not abandonment, but sacrifice, not rejection, but protection. At 2 a.m, he gave up the pretense of rest and rose, moving through the house with the restless energy of someone searching for answers in the only place they might exist. He returned to his grandmother's bedroom, switching on the small bedside lamp that cast a warm yellow glow across the sparse furnishings. The room was neat to the point of being austere, everything in its place, nothing excessive or decorative beyond the photographs on the wall. He opened the dresser drawers one by one, finding folded clothes that smelled faintly of lavender, simple and practical garments that spoke of a life lived without vanity or comfort. In the bottom drawer, pushed toward the back and covered by a folded blanket, his fingers touched something, solid and wooden. He pulled it out carefully, a small carved box made of dark walnut, its surface smooth from years of handling. The lid opened on silent hinges, and inside, nestled in folds of tissue paper that had yellowed with age, were the remnants of a life he had never known. There were baby clothes, impossibly tiny, a pale blue onesie and matching cap, a pair of knitted booties so small they fit in the palm of his hand. Beneath them was a hospital bracelet, the plastic brittle and cracked but the printed information still legible. Baby boy Hayes, and a date 24 years ago, the day of his birth. The discovery hit him like a physical blow, proof that his grandmother had kept something of him, had preserved these tokens of his earliest existence, even as she had given him away. But it was the photograph that truly shattered him. It was a simple snapshot, slightly faded, showing a young woman with long, dark hair sitting in a chair, holding a newborn infant wrapped in a white blanket. The woman was looking down at the baby with an expression that even through the decades radiated pure love and wonder. But her face had been carefully, deliberately cut away, excised from the photograph with what must have been scissors or a razor blade, leaving only a blank oval where her features should have been. Ethan held the mutilated photograph in his trembling hands, staring at the headless woman who had held him, wondering who she was and why his grandmother had destroyed her face while preserving everything else. His mother, he assumed, though no one had ever told him anything about her. At the very bottom of the box he found a journal, its leather cover worn soft with handling. He opened it eagerly, hungry for answers, but his hope quickly turned to frustration, and then to a deeper, more unsettling confusion. Most of the pages had been torn out, ripped cleanly from the binding, leaving only ragged edges and the ghost impressions of words pressed through from the missing sheets. Only a few pages remained intact, scattered throughout the journal, like clues in a puzzle that had been deliberately dismantled. The first fragment read, "I have to protect him. It's the only way." Several pages later, another entry. "They can never know where he is. They can never find him." And near the end, in handwriting that looked shakier, more desperate. "I watch him from a distance. He's growing up strong. He'll never understand. But someday, if he finds this, maybe he'll forgive me." Ethan sat on the edge of his grandmother's bed, the box and its contents spread around him, and felt the weight of a mystery that was far deeper and darker than simple abandonment. The sound of an engine broke the morning silence, a mechanical growl that grew louder as it approached the property. Ethan, who had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep just before dawn, jerked awake on the couch, his heart hammering with the instinctive wariness of someone who had learned early that, Unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. He moved to the window and saw an ATV bouncing up the dirt road, kicking up small clouds of dust in the morning light. The rider was an elderly man, broad-shouldered despite his age, wearing a faded denim jacket and a sweat-stained cowboy hat that looked like it had weathered decades of Montana seasons. The ATV came to a stop near the porch, and the man climbed off with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested, but whose spirit refused to acknowledge the limitations of age. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, and the two men regarded each other with the cautious assessment of strangers, meeting in a place where strangers were rare. The older man spoke first, his voice a gravelly rumble that matched his weathered appearance. "Didn't expect to see anyone here," he said, pushing his hat back slightly to get a better look at Ethan. "Thought the place would stay empty like it has been since Claire passed." He extended a calloused hand. "Name's Walt Kramer. I own the property to the east. Been neighbours with your grandmother for near about 30 years. Ethan shook his hand, feeling the strength still present in the old rancher's grip. "Ethan Hayes," he introduced himself. "I'm Claire's grandson. I just inherited the place." Walt's eyes widened slightly, a flash of surprise crossing his weathered features. "Didn't know Claire had any family," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "She kept to herself all these years, never talked about her past, never mentioned having a grandson." He looked past Ethan towards the barn, his expression growing more serious. "She was particular about this place, especially that barn. Never let anyone near it. I offered to help her fix the roof when it started leaking a few years back, and she damn near ran me off the property." Walt's gaze returned to Ethan, assessing. She'd come into town maybe once a month for supplies, always looked over her shoulder like she expected someone to be following her. Folks thought she was just a crazy old hermit, but I always figured there was more to it than that. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "You planning to stay, or you here to sell?" Ethan hesitated, unsure of the answer himself. "I haven't decided yet. I only just arrived yesterday." Walt nodded slowly. "Well, if you're thinking about selling, you should know that Richard Voss has been trying to buy this land for as long as I can remember. He owns the largest ranch in the county, got his fingers in half the businesses in town, and he's not a man who likes being told no. He made your grandmother offers over the years, generous ones too, but she refused every time. Never would say why, just told him the land wasn't for sale at any price." The old rancher's expression grew darker. "After she passed, he tried to buy it from the county during the estate process, but the lawyers said it had to go to the heir. I'm guessing that's you. Don't be surprised if Voss comes calling with an offer." There was a warning in Walt's voice, something unspoken but clear. "Is he dangerous?" Ethan asked directly. Walt considered the question. "Richard Voss is powerful, and powerful men in small counties can make life very difficult for people who get in their way. I'm not saying he'd do anything illegal, but I am saying that folks who've crossed him tend to have bad luck." He climbed back onto his ATV, preparing to leave. "If you need anything, my place is about 3 miles east. Just follow the fence line. And son, whatever your grandmother was protecting in that barn, she thought it was worth dedicating her whole life to keeping it secret." Walt's warning lingered in Ethan's mind long after the sound of the ATV had faded into the distance, but it did nothing to diminish his determination to discover what lay behind the locked barn doors. He spent the rest of the morning exploring the property more thoroughly, finding a small equipment shed behind the farmhouse that contained the accumulated tools of decades of farm work. Among the rusted saws and coiled lengths of rope, he found what he needed: a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters, their handles worn smooth from use, their cutting edges still sharp enough to serve their purpose. He carried them back to the barn, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make, understanding on some instinctive level that once he broke that seal, there would be no going back to the simple narrative of abandonment he had carried his entire life. The padlock was old, and the metal had weakened with years of exposure to the elements. But it still took 3 attempts before the bolt cutters finally sheared through the rusted shackle with a sharp crack that echoed across the clearing. The chains fell away, coiling in the dirt like dead snakes, and Ethan pulled open the barn doors, their hinges protesting with a long, low groan that sounded almost like a warning. Darkness yawned before him, thick and absolute, untouched by the morning sun. He retrieved a flashlight from his truck and stepped inside, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a space that was surprisingly organized and well-maintained. The barn was larger than it appeared from the outside, its interior divided into distinct areas that spoke of careful planning and deliberate arrangement. Against one wall stood an old pickup truck from the 1980s, covered with a heavy tarp that had kept the dust at bay. Farm equipment lined another wall, each piece clean and properly stored despite years of apparent disuse. There were workbenches with tools arranged in orderly rows, shelves holding carefully labeled boxes, and along the rafters, neatly coiled rope and chains hung from iron hooks. This was not the chaotic accumulation of a hoarder or the neglected space of someone who had simply walked away. This was the organized archive of someone who had maintained this space with purpose and intention. Ethan moved deeper into the barn, his flashlight beam sweeping across the walls, and that was when he saw it. In the back corner, partially hidden behind a stack of hay bales that looked decorative rather than functional, was a wooden door. It was not original to the barn's construction. The wood was newer, the frame clearly built later and integrated into what appeared to be a false wall that extended about 8 feet across. The door itself was solid oak, fitted with a heavy deadbolt lock that gleamed dully in the flashlight beam, and nailed to its surface at eye level was another note, this one written on the same type of paper as the first, protected by the same plastic sleeve. Ethan pulled it free and read the words that made his chest tighten with frustration and confusion. "The key is where we said goodbye." He stood in the darkness of the barn, surrounded by his grandmother's carefully preserved secrets, and felt the crushing weight of a memory he did not possess. He had no recollection of ever saying goodbye to anyone, no moment of parting that he could draw upon, no tender scene of separation that might offer a clue to this final riddle. His entire childhood had been a series of hellos and goodbyes, with foster families and temporary guardians, none of them meaningful enough to constitute the goodbye his grandmother referred to. None of them connected to this place or this woman he had never known. Frustrated by the cryptic note and unable to decipher its meaning without more information, Ethan decided that if he could not unlock his grandmother's secrets directly, he would at least try to understand who she had been in life. The town of Clearwater was marked on the old map he had found in the farmhouse, a small dot 30 miles to the south, and he drove there through winding mountain roads that offered glimpses of the vast wilderness that surrounded these isolated communities. The town itself was exactly what he had expected. A single main street lined with weathered buildings, a gas station, a general store, a post office, and near the center, a diner with a faded sign that read Marla's Place in cheerful red letters that had been painted over so many times they had a textured, layered quality. The interior was clean and homey, with red vinyl booths and a long counter where a few locals sat nursing coffee and reading the newspaper. A woman in her late 50s, round-faced and kind-eyed, approached with a pot of coffee and a smile that seemed genuinely welcoming. "Just you today, honey?" she asked, and Ethan nodded, sliding into a booth near the window. She poured him coffee without asking and set down a laminated menu. "I'm Marla," she said. "You're not from around here, I can tell that much." Ethan wrapped his hands around the warm mug, grateful for something to hold. "I just inherited my grandmother's farm," he said carefully. "Claire Hayes. Did you know her?" The change in Marla's expression was immediate and profound, her welcoming smile fading into something more complex, a mixture of surprise and what looked like sympathy. "Claire," she said softly, sliding into the booth across from him without invitation. Lord, I haven't heard that name spoken aloud in months. You're her grandson." When Ethan nodded, Marla shook her head slowly. She never mentioned having family. She'd come into town maybe once a month, always on a Tuesday morning, always bought the same things, basic groceries, lamp oil, sometimes a newspaper. She'd pay cash, never used a credit card, and she'd be in and out as fast as possible. Marla's eyes grew distant with memory. But the thing I remember most was how nervous she always seemed. She'd constantly look over her shoulder, watch the door, keep her back to the wall when she ate. A few of us tried to be friendly over the years, but she made it clear she wanted to be left alone. Wasn't mean about it, just firm. Ethan leaned forward. "I was born here, or near here. Do you know which hospital?" Marla thought for a moment. "There's only one hospital within 100 miles, the County Medical Center about 10 miles east of here. But if you want official records, you'll need to go to the County Administration Building. It's just down the street, the brick building next to the post office. Betty in the records office can help you, though she'll charge you $5 for copies." An hour later, Ethan stood in a small, stuffy office that smelled of old paper and copier toner, holding a certified copy of his birth certificate. The document was brief and strangely incomplete, raising more questions than it answered. His name was listed as Ethan James Hayes. His date of birth matched what he had always known. But the line for mother's name simply read "unknown" in typed letters. His grandmother, Claire Hayes, was listed as his legal guardian from birth, and the attending physician's signature was barely legible. There was no father listed, no home address, nothing that connected him to a history beyond the simple fact of his existence. He read the document 3 times, each reading deepening his confusion and his sense that his birth, like everything else connected to his grandmother, had been deliberately obscured. Ethan returned to the farm as the afternoon light was beginning to fade, his mind churning with the information he had gathered in town and the troubling blanks on his birth certificate, but he was unprepared for what awaited him. During his absence, a light snow had begun to fall, the first of the season, dusting the property with a thin white blanket that transformed the landscape into something both beautiful and unsettling. He pulled his truck up to the farmhouse and immediately noticed something wrong, a disturbance in the pristine snow that made his pulse quicken, and his instincts, honed by years of being watchful in unwelcoming places, flare to life. There were footprints, fresh ones, clearly defined in the new snow, and they circled the barn in a deliberate pattern before moving toward the farmhouse itself. Ethan climbed out of his truck slowly, his eyes following the trail, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. The prints were large, made by boots with a distinctive tread pattern, definitely not Walt's worn work boots, and they moved with purpose, not the wandering path of someone lost or confused. Whoever had made them had walked the entire perimeter of the barn, stopping at intervals as if examining the structure from every angle, and then had approached the farmhouse, the prints leading directly to the windows where they clustered in small groups, evidence that someone had stood there, looking inside, watching. The violation of it, the knowledge that while he had been in town searching for answers, someone had been here, observing his temporary home, cataloguing his presence, sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. He followed the prints away from the house, tracking them as they led back through the clearing toward the main road, and then, just as they reached the tree line, they simply ended, obliterated by the heavier snowfall under the dense canopy of pines, or deliberately obscured by whoever had made them. Ethan stood at the spot where the trail vanished, looking back at the farmhouse and barn, seeing the property as the intruder must have seen it, and understanding with uncomfortable clarity that he was being assessed, measured, perhaps even threatened. He walked back to the barn, his boots crunching in the snow, and stopped dead when he reached the doors. The broken padlock he had cut through yesterday, which he had left lying in the dirt along with the chains, was gone, not fallen aside or kicked away, but completely removed, taken with clear intention. The chains, too, had vanished, leaving only faint impressions in the snow where they had lain. Someone had come to the property, surveilled both structures, examined the evidence of his forced entry, and then removed the physical proof of the broken lock. A message that was impossible to misinterpret. "We know you are here. We know what you are doing, and we can come and go as we please." Ethan pulled open the barn doors, his heart hammering, half expecting to find the interior ransacked or destroyed, but everything appeared exactly as he had left it. The tarp-covered truck, the organized tools, the false wall with its locked door and cryptic note. Nothing had been disturbed, nothing had been taken, which somehow made the intrusion even more menacing, because it meant the visit had only one purpose: to observe, to intimidate, to let him know that his presence had been noted, and that the secrets his grandmother had protected were still of interest to someone willing to trespass and threaten. He closed the barn doors and returned to the farmhouse as darkness settled over the property, locking the door behind him for the first time, though he suspected that locks would provide little real protection against whoever had left those prints in the snow. The night passed without incident, but Ethan did not sleep. Instead, sitting in the darkened farmhouse with his grandfather's old hunting rifle that he had found in a closet, watching the windows and listening to every sound the old building made. When dawn finally broke, pale and cold, he made coffee and forced himself to think methodically about the problem. Before him, "The key is where we said goodbye." The phrase had circled in his mind all night, and he had come to a realization that felt both obvious and profound. His grandmother was not referring to a goodbye between them, because that goodbye had never happened, but rather to a goodbye she had experienced, a loss she had mourned, a final parting that had been significant enough to use as a landmark in her cryptic instructions. He thought about the photographs in her bedroom, the sparse decorations, the life of isolation she had lived, and he wondered what goodbyes she had endured in her years alone on this property. With the morning sun casting long shadows across the snow-dusted ground, Ethan began a systematic search of the property, looking for anything that might represent a place of parting, a memorial, a marker of loss. He walked the fence lines, examined the outbuildings, studied the edge of the forest, and was about to give up when he noticed something at the far eastern boundary of the property, near where the cleared land gave way to dense pine forest. It was a stone, larger than the surrounding rocks, positioned deliberately rather than naturally, and partially obscured by years of accumulated pine needles and creeping moss. He knelt beside it and began pulling away the organic debris, his fingers growing numb in the cold as he worked. The stone was a marker, roughly 2 feet tall and a foot wide, its surface worn smooth by weather and time, and carved into its face, barely visible beneath the moss, were words. He pulled out his pocket knife and carefully scraped away the green growth, revealing the inscription letter by letter. "Here lies Sadie, beloved friend, 1995 to 2008. It was a pet grave, a memorial to what must have been his grandmother's dog, and the dates told him that Sadie had lived 13 years, had been with Claire during the lonely decades on this isolated farm, had been her companion when human companionship was too dangerous to risk. This was where Claire had said goodbye, not to a person, but to the one living being she had allowed herself to love. Ethan sat back on his heels, moved by the simple memorial and the glimpse it offered into his grandmother's solitary life. And then he understood the next step. If the key was where they said goodbye, it would not be on the marker, but in it, beneath it, buried with the memories. He began to dig beside the stone, using a fallen branch to break the cold earth, working carefully, because he was excavating not just soil, but a grave. And despite everything, he felt he owed his grandmother's companion that respect. About a foot down, his makeshift tool struck something solid and metallic. He cleared the dirt away with his hands, revealing a metal lockbox, roughly the size of a shoebox, its surface corroded by years in the damp earth, but still intact. He lifted it out carefully, brushed away the clinging soil, and forced open the rusted clasp. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the moisture at bay, were 2 items: a tarnished brass key attached to a simple cord, and a sealed envelope with his name written across it in the same careful handwriting as the notes on the barn doors, and in the corner a date written in trembling script from just 1 week before his grandmother had died. Ethan carried the lockbox back to the farmhouse, his hands trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of anticipation and dread that had settled in his chest. He placed it on the kitchen table and sat down, staring at the envelope that bore his name in handwriting, that belonged to a woman who had been a stranger in life, but who was rapidly becoming the most important figure in his understanding of himself. The envelope was sealed with old-fashioned wax, a deep red that had cracked slightly over time, and he broke it carefully, sliding out a single sheet of paper that had been folded with precise, deliberate creases. The letter was written in the same careful cursive as the notes, but there was a shakiness to some of the letters that suggested it had been written by a hand weakened by age or illness, and as Ethan began to read, he felt his entire understanding of his life shift and realign like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of his known world. "Ethan," it began, and even that simple opening struck him, because it was the first time his grandmother had directly addressed him, the first acknowledgement that she had thought of him as a specific person rather than an abstract problem to be solved. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have finally come home. I know you must have questions, and I know that my actions must seem cruel and unforgivable, but I need you to understand that everything I did was to keep you safe. I gave you up, not because I did not want you, but because a man who would have used you to control me, to force my silence, to destroy everything your grandfather died protecting. I could not let that happen. I could not let you become a weapon against the truth." The words hit Ethan like physical blows, each sentence dismantling the narrative of abandonment he had built his identity around. "Everything you need to know is behind the door in the barn," the letter continued. "The key you have found will open it. Inside, you will discover why your grandfather was killed, why your mother died, and why I spent 25 years living in fear and isolation. The truth is terrible, but it is yours now, and with it comes a choice. You can walk away, sell this property, take the money, and build a life far from here, or you can do what I could not do, what I was too afraid to do. You can expose what happened. You can bring justice to people who have lived above it for too long." Ethan's eyes burned as he read on. "I am sorry I could not be your grandmother in the way you deserved. I am sorry I could not hold you, could not watch you grow, could not give you the love that should have been your birthright. But know this, I was always watching over you. I made arrangements through lawyers to ensure you were placed in the best situations the system could offer. I followed your progress from a distance. I saw your school photographs, read the reports, knew when you struggled and when you succeeded, and I was proud of you every single day." The letter was signed simply Claire, not grandmother, not with any claim to a relationship she had sacrificed, and beneath the signature, in letters that were barely legible, as if written with the last of her strength, were 5 words that broke something fundamental inside him. "I loved you from a distance." Ethan sat at the table as the morning sun climbed higher, the letter clutched in his hands, and wept for the grandmother he had never known, for the love that had existed in the shadows of his life, unacknowledged and unrecognized, and for the terrible burden of truth that she had now placed in his inexperienced hands. With the brass key clutched in his hand and his grandmother's letter folded carefully in his jacket pocket, Ethan returned to the barn, moving through the organized space with a sense of purpose that was tempered by apprehension about what he would discover behind the locked door. The key slid into the deadbolt with a smooth precision that suggested it had been made specifically for this lock, and when he turned it, The mechanism released with a solid click that echoed in the cavernous space. He pulled the door open slowly, half expecting some dramatic revelation, but instead he was met with darkness so complete it seemed solid, impenetrable. He switched on his flashlight and stepped through the doorway into a space that was far smaller than the main barn, but infinitely more significant. The room was perhaps 12 feet square, windowless and sealed, its walls lined with sheets of corkboard that had been carefully mounted and covered with layers of paper, photographs, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn diagrams connected by lengths of colored string that created a web of relationships and connections. Against one wall stood a narrow cot with a thin mattress and a neatly folded blanket, evidence that his grandmother had spent considerable time in this space, perhaps even slept here when her work demanded it. A small desk occupied the center of the room, its surface buried beneath stacks of papers, file folders, and yellowed notebooks filled with his grandmother's precise handwriting. There was a single folding chair, a camping lantern that still held oil, and on the floor beside the desk, a cardboard box filled with more documents and what appeared to be cassette tapes labeled with dates and initials. Ethan lit the lantern, its warm glow pushing back the darkness and illuminating the walls in a way that made the scope of his grandmother's work suddenly, devastatingly clear. This was not a simple collection of memorabilia or the obsessive accumulation of a disturbed mind. This was a comprehensive investigation, a detailed and methodical documentation of something that had consumed years of his grandmother's life. He moved to the nearest wall and began to read the newspaper clippings, each one carefully preserved in plastic sleeves and arranged in chronological order. The headlines told a story of tragedy. 37 dead in Voss mine collapse. Rescue efforts abandoned after 72 hours. Community mourns devastating loss. Investigation launched into mining disaster. The articles were from regional and national newspapers, all dated from the fall of 1992, the year before Ethan was born, and they all concerned the same event, a catastrophic collapse at the Voss Mining Company's primary copper mine in the mountains northwest of Clearwater. The disaster had killed 37 men, trapping them deep underground when a supporting tunnel had given way, and the rescue efforts had been called off after 3 days when it became clear that no one could have survived. Ethan read article after article, each one adding details to the tragedy, the names of the dead, interviews with grieving families, statements from company officials expressing their shock and sadness, and promises from Richard Voss himself that a full investigation would determine the cause and ensure such a tragedy never happened again. But it was the articles his grandmother had marked with an angry red pen, the ones she had annotated with exclamation points and question marks, that told a different story. These were smaller pieces, buried in the back pages. Miners had reported safety concerns weeks before collapse. Former inspector claims warnings were ignored. Families question official account of disaster. Ethan spent hours in the sealed room, moving methodically from one wall to the next, reading every clipping, every notation, every piece of evidence that his grandmother had assembled with the dedication of someone building a legal case or perhaps preparing for a war. The story that emerged was not one of tragic accident, but of calculated negligence, corporate greed, and a cover-up that had lasted 3 decades. The clippings that Claire had marked most heavily revealed a pattern that had been visible to anyone willing to look closely. In the 6 months leading up to the collapse, multiple miners had filed complaints about the mine's structural integrity, reporting cracks in support beams, unusual sounds in the deep tunnels, and sections of ceiling that showed signs of stress and imminent failure. These complaints had been documented, submitted to the company's safety office, and according to the official record, had been investigated and deemed not to pose significant risk. But Claire had gone further than the newspaper accounts, had dug deeper than the official investigations, and had assembled a collection of evidence that told a very different story. Among the papers on the desk, Ethan found a folder labeled Witness Statements, and inside were handwritten testimonies, each one signed and dated from former Voss mining employees who had been willing to speak to Claire in the years after the disaster. One statement from a miner named Carlos Ramirez described how he and 3 others had filed a formal complaint about a specific tunnel section just 2 weeks before the collapse, the exact section that had eventually failed, and how their complaint had been dismissed by the safety supervisor, with a warning that troublemakers who couldn't handle the work should find employment elsewhere. Another testimony from a woman named Janet Holloway, who had worked in the company's administrative offices, described being ordered to refile reports, to change the dates and details of maintenance inspections, to make it appear that problems had been addressed when in fact they had been ignored. She had quit in protest 2 months before the collapse and had tried to report what she knew to state authorities, but her complaints had been buried in bureaucratic processes and ultimately dismissed. But it was the photographs that provided the most damning evidence, and Ethan studied them with growing horror and fascination. His grandmother had somehow obtained, or perhaps been given by a source inside the company, photographs of internal Voss mining memoranda, documents that should have been confidential and that revealed the cold calculus behind the decisions that had led to 37 deaths. One memo, dated 8 months before the collapse, was from Richard Voss himself to his operations manager, and its subject line read, "Cost-benefit analysis of safety compliance." The document laid out in precise financial terms the expense of shutting down the questionable tunnel section for reinforcement work versus the cost of potential liability if an accident occurred, and it concluded with a recommendation to continue operations because the statistical probability of catastrophic failure within the fiscal year remains below acceptable risk thresholds, and projected revenue loss from operational suspension would exceed potential settlement costs by a factor of 3 to 1. It was a death sentence written in the language of corporate accounting, a document that valued profit over human life with a clarity that was breathtaking in its callousness. Another photographed memo discussed acceptable losses in the context of mining operations, arguing that a certain number of deaths per year were industry standard and should not trigger operational changes unless they exceeded regional averages. As Ethan continued his examination of the room, moving from the walls to the desk and the stacks of carefully organized folders, he found one that was separate from the others, placed in the top drawer of the desk as if it held special significance, and on its tab was written a single name in his grandmother's handwriting: Thomas. He opened it with trembling hands, some part of him already understanding that this folder would contain the answers to questions he had not even known to ask. And inside he found a collection of documents that transformed the mining disaster from a tragic historical event into something personal, intimate, and devastating. The first document was an employment record from Voss Mining Company, and it identified Thomas Edward Hayes as the mine's chief safety inspector, a position he had held for 8 years, leading up to 1992. There was a photograph clipped to the record, a formal company ID photo, that showed a man in his late 30s with kind eyes and a serious expression, wearing a hard hat and safety vest. And Ethan stared at the image of his grandfather, a man he had never known existed until this moment, searching the features for some trace of himself. Beneath the employment record was the official accident report from the mining disaster, and Thomas Hayes was listed among the 37 men who had died in the collapse. His body reportedly never recovered, due to the extent of the tunnel failure and the decision to seal the unstable sections rather than risk additional lives in recovery efforts. But paperclipped to this official report was another document, one that made Ethan's heart stop and then restart with a painful, irregular rhythm. A death certificate for Thomas Edward Hayes, dated 2 weeks before the mine collapse, with the cause of death listed as accidental fall from height, and the location given as a hiking trail on the edge of Richard Voss's private ranch property. The discrepancy was glaring and impossible to reconcile. How could a man die in a fall 2 weeks before dying in a mine collapse? The official mining disaster report had never been corrected, had never acknowledged that one of the men listed among the dead had actually died in a separate, earlier incident. And this omission could not have been accidental. Beside the death certificate, Claire had written in angry, emphatic script, "He never fell. He was pushed. They killed him because he knew, because he was going to shut it down, because he was going to expose them." Ethan found more documents that supported his grandmother's conclusion. A letter Thomas had drafted, but apparently never sent, addressed to the Federal Mine Safety and Health Administration, detailing structural deficiencies in the mine and requesting an immediate federal inspection. There were pages of technical notes in Thomas's handwriting, documenting measurements, calculations, and observations that painted a picture of a mine that was dangerously unstable and operating in clear violation of federal safety standards. Most damning of all was a photocopy of a memo Thomas had written to Richard Voss 3 weeks before his death, formally recommending the immediate closure of the affected tunnel sections and warning that continued operation posed an unacceptable risk of catastrophic failure resulting in significant loss of life. The memo concluded with a statement that if Voss did not voluntarily shut down the dangerous sections within 48 hours, Thomas would have no choice but to report the violations to state and federal authorities. 2 days after that memo was dated, according to a newspaper clipping Claire had included, Thomas Hayes had been found dead at the base of a cliff, his death ruled an accident by the local sheriff's department after a cursory investigation that had concluded he had simply lost his footing while hiking. Ethan sat at the desk, surrounded by the evidence of his grandfather's murder and the conspiracy that had led to the deaths of 37 men, and felt the weight of a history he had never known pressing down on him with suffocating force. As he began to organize the documents, preparing to read through everything more carefully, he noticed that one of the desk drawers, smaller than the others, and set into the side of the desk, had a keyhole, but no visible handle, as if it had been designed to remain permanently closed. He pulled at the edges, finding no purchase, and then used his pocket knife to pry at the seam until the wood splintered and the drawer popped open with a crack that sounded too loud in the sealed room. Inside was a single folder, thinner than the others, and when he opened it, he found himself staring at a document that was both familiar and utterly foreign. His birth certificate, but not the incomplete, redacted version he had obtained from the county records office. This was the original, the unaltered record of his entry into the world. The mother's name line, which had read "unknown" on the official copy, here bore a name written in clear typed letters: Sarah Marie Hayes. His mother had a name, an identity, a place in the historical record, and Ethan felt something inside him that had been hollow and undefined suddenly take shape and weight. Attached to the birth certificate, with a rusted paperclip, was a newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle with age, from a local paper dated April 1993, 3 months after Ethan's birth. The headline read, "Young Mother Dies in Tragic Accident," and the brief article described how Sarah Hayes, age 22, had died when her car left a mountain road during a rainstorm and plunged into a ravine. The article noted that she was survived by her mother, Claire Hayes, and her infant son, and that the accident was attributed to poor visibility and hazardous road conditions. It was a simple tragedy, the kind that happened in mountain communities where roads were narrow and weather could turn deadly without warning. And if not, for what Ethan had already learned about his grandfather's death, he might have accepted it at face value. But Claire had not accepted it, and her handwritten notes in the margins of the clipping told a different, darker story. She knew what they did to Thomas, Claire had written in script that grew increasingly agitated and jagged as the note progressed. She was keeping records, collecting evidence, planning to testify to federal investigators. She told me she had proof they murdered him, that she could connect Voss directly to the cover-up. 2 days later, her brakes failed on a clear day, not during a storm like they reported. The sheriff never investigated properly, because the sheriff works for Voss. They couldn't let her speak. They couldn't let her expose what they had done. The final line, written in letters so forceful they had nearly torn through the paper, read, "They killed my daughter to protect their secrets." Ethan sat in the lamplight, holding the birth certificate and the clipping, and understood with devastating clarity the full scope of what had happened. His grandfather had discovered criminal negligence that threatened Richard Voss's empire, and he had been murdered to silence him. His mother, young and grieving, and determined to seek justice for the man she loved, had gathered evidence to continue his work, and she too had been killed. And Claire, having lost her husband and her daughters to the same powerful enemy, had made the most painful decision a grandmother could make. She had given up her grandson, had erased his connection to the Hayes family, had hidden him in the anonymity of the state system where Richard Voss could never find him, and use him as leverage or eliminate him as a threat. Ethan spent the rest of the day in the barn room, photographing every document, every clipping, every piece of evidence with his phone, creating a digital archive that he uploaded to a cloud storage service as a precaution against the very real possibility that someone might destroy the originals. As darkness fell and he finally returned to the farmhouse, exhausted both physically and emotionally from the revelations of the day, he made himself a simple meal that he barely tasted and sat at the kitchen table, trying to process the staggering weight of what he had learned. He was not simply an unwanted child. He was the survivor of a family that had been systematically destroyed by a powerful man who valued profit over human life. He was contemplating his next move, considering whether he should contact authorities or lawyers, or simply pack everything and flee, when he heard the sound that had become a source of immediate tension, the low rumble of an engine approaching the property. But this was not Walt's ATV or the rough diesel of a work truck. This was the smooth, powerful purr of an expensive vehicle, and Ethan immediately switched off the lights in the farmhouse and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. A luxury SUV, black and gleaming, even in the dim moonlight, pulled up to the property, with the confidence of someone who had every right to be there, and 3 men emerged from its interior. The driver and 1 passenger were younger, broad-shouldered men in dark clothing, who carried themselves with the alert posture of security personnel or enforcers, but it was the 3rd man who commanded Ethan's attention and made his pulse quicken with recognition. He was tall, despite his age, which Ethan estimated at somewhere in his 70s, and he wore an expensive wool coat over what appeared to be a tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his face still handsome in the way of men who had spent their lives wielding power and expecting deference. Even in the darkness, even having never met him in person, Ethan recognized him from the photographs in the barn, from the company memos, from the newspaper articles. This was Richard Voss, the man who had killed his grandfather, murdered his mother, and stolen 24 years of family from him. Voss approached the farmhouse with measured, deliberate steps, his 2 companions flanking him at a respectful distance, and he stopped at the base of the porch steps, looking directly at the darkened windows, as if he could see through them to where Ethan stood watching. He did not knock, did not announce himself formally, but instead called out in a voice that was surprisingly strong and clear for a man his age, a voice accustomed to boardrooms and command. "I know you are in there, boy," Voss said, and the casual contempt in the word boy made Ethan's hands clench into fists. "Your grandmother was a foolish woman who wasted her entire life nursing grudges and collecting conspiracy theories. I tried to reason with her, tried to buy this worthless piece of land from her for more than it was worth, but she was too stubborn to see sense. I am hoping you are smarter than she was." He paused, letting the words hang in the cold night air. "Whatever you think you found in that barn, whatever fairy tales Claire filled those boxes with, it is ancient history. No one cares about a mine that closed 30 years ago. The investigation was done. The families were compensated. The case is closed. You are too young to remember. But I built this county. I provided jobs and prosperity when there was nothing here but poverty and despair." His voice hardened, losing the veneer of reasonableness. "Sell me this land and walk away wealthy, or stay and end up just like her, alone and forgotten, wasting your life on ghosts. He pulled an envelope from his coat pocket and placed it on the porch railing, then turned and walked back to his vehicle without waiting for a response, his companions following. And within moments the SUV was gone, leaving only the envelope and the unmistakable scent of threat hanging in the mountain air. Ethan waited a full 10 minutes after the sound of the SUV's engine had faded completely before he unlocked the farmhouse door and stepped onto the porch, the cold night air biting at his face as he reached for the envelope that Voss had left on the railing. It was heavy, made of expensive cream-colored paper, with a weight and texture that spoke of money and power, and his name was written across the front in elegant script that had almost certainly been done by a professional calligrapher, rather than by Voss himself. He brought it inside, locked the door behind him, and sat at the kitchen table under the harsh light of a single bulb, staring at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. Inside were 3 items: a cashier's check drawn on a regional bank, made out to Ethan Hayes for the sum of $500,000, an amount so staggering that he had to read it 3 times to believe it was real. A multi-page purchase agreement, printed on legal letterhead from a law firm in Billings, already filled out with his name and the property description, requiring only his signature to transfer ownership, and a handwritten note on personal stationery that bore the embossed initials RV in gold leaf at the top. The note was brief and written in a strong masculine hand that matched the arrogance of the man who had delivered it. "This is more generosity than your grandmother deserved," it read. "She refused every offer I made for 25 years, choosing poverty and isolation over common sense. I am giving you 1 week to accept this offer, which is far more than this worthless property is worth on the open market. Sign the agreement, take the money, and build yourself a future somewhere far from here. Do not be as stubborn as Claire was. It would be a shame if you wasted your youth the way she wasted her life." The words dripped with condescension and barely veiled threat, but it was the purchase agreement itself that revealed the true nature of Voss's offer. Ethan read through the dense legal language carefully, his years of navigating bureaucratic systems in the foster care apparatus having taught him to pay attention to details that others might miss, and what he found confirmed his darkest suspicions. The agreement did not simply transfer ownership of the land. It included specific clauses that required the immediate demolitions of all structures on the property, including the barn, within 30 days of the sale's completion. Another clause stipulated that all personal property, documents, and materials currently stored on the premises would be transferred to the buyer as part of the sale, with no exceptions and no right of removal by the seller. There was even a confidentiality clause that would legally prohibit Ethan from discussing anything he had found on the property, or making any claims about the history of the land or the previous owner's activities. This was not a real estate transaction. It was the purchase of silence, the elimination of evidence, the final act in a cover-up that had lasted 3 decades. Voss was not buying a farm. He was buying the destruction of the last remaining proof of his crimes, and he was willing to pay $500,000 to ensure that Claire's archive, Thomas's evidence, and Sarah's legacy were reduced to ash and rubble. Ethan sat at the table, the check in one hand and the agreement in the other, and thought about what that money could mean. Security, education, a life free from the poverty and uncertainty that had defined his existence. Then he thought about his grandfather, murdered and thrown from a cliff. His mother, run off a road in the rain. His grandmother, living in fear and isolation for 25 years. He picked up the cashier's check, that symbol of blood money and complicity, and slowly, deliberately, tore it in half, then in quarters, then into pieces so small they fluttered to the table like snow. The morning after Voss's visit, Ethan drove back to Clearwater with a sense of purpose that was tempered by the knowledge that he was stepping into a battle for which he was woefully unprepared. He had evidence, he had truth, but he had no understanding of the power structures that had kept that truth buried for 3 decades, and he needed information before he could decide on his next move. The diner was busier than it had been during his first visit, filled with the breakfast crowd of ranchers and workers, but Marla spotted him immediately, and her expression shifted from professional welcome to something more cautious and concerned. She poured him coffee without asking, and then, after delivering orders to 2 other tables, slid into the booth across from him, with directness that suggested she had been expecting him to return. "You look like a man who has discovered something he wishes he had not," she said quietly, her kind eyes searching his face. "I'm guessing you found whatever Claire was hiding out there on that property." Ethan wrapped his hands around the warm mug, grateful for something to hold. "I found a lot of things," he said carefully, "and I am trying to understand what I should do with what I have learned. I need to know about Richard Voss, about his influence in this town, about what happens to people who stand up to him." Marla's expression darkened, and she glanced around the diner before leaning closer, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "Richard Voss owns half this county, literally owns it. The land, the businesses, the buildings. He sits on the county commission, the hospital board, the school board, and he has close personal ties to the sheriff, the mayor, and the district judge. When something needs to get done in this county, it goes through Voss first, and if Voss does not approve, it does not happen." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "People who cross him tend to have bad luck. Their businesses fail because the bank suddenly calls in loans. Their homes get condemned because inspectors find violations that never existed before. They get charged with crimes, usually tax, evasion or fraud, things that are hard to disprove, and they end up bankrupted by legal fees, even if the charges get dropped. Some people have accidents, nothing that looks suspicious on paper, just bad timing and bad fortune." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Has anyone ever successfully stood up to him?" Marla was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant, and then she nodded slowly. "There was one person, about 10 years ago. A journalist named Beth Corman used to work for the regional paper. She started investigating some of Voss's business dealings, asking questions about his mining operations back in the day. She got close to something real, something that made Voss nervous. There was pressure on her editor to kill the story, and when she would not let it go, she lost her job. But she did not leave town, did not give up. She lives out on the far side of the valley, now, in a cabin near Willow Creek, and as far as I know, she is still alive, still watching, still waiting for someone to bring her the evidence she never could find." She pulled a napkin from the dispenser and wrote down directions in quick, efficient strokes. "If you have found something real, something that matters, Beth Corman is the only person in this county who might be able to help you. But Ethan, you need to be very careful. Claire survived for 25 years by staying hidden and keeping her head down. The moment you start asking questions, the moment you involve other people, Voss will know, and he will act." The drive to Beth Corman's cabin took Ethan deep into territory even more remote than his grandmother's farm, following Marla's directions along increasingly narrow roads, until he reached a place where the valley opened up into a small clearing, surrounded by aspens that had turned gold with the season. The cabin was modest but well-maintained, smoke rising from its chimney, and when Ethan knocked on the door, the woman who answered had the immediate defensive posture of someone who had learned not to trust unexpected visitors. Beth Corman was in her 60s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical braid, and sharp blue eyes that assessed him with the intensity of someone trained to see past surfaces and evasions. She stood in the doorway, blocking entry, one hand resting on the frame in a way that suggested she was prepared to slam the door at the first sign of trouble. "I do not buy anything. I do not donate to causes, and I do not answer surveys," she said flatly. "Whatever you are selling, I am not interested." Ethan held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I am not selling anything. My name is Ethan Hayes, and I am trying to learn about something that happened a long time ago, something involving the Voss mining disaster in 1992. Marla at the diner said you might be willing to talk to me." The mention of Voss made Beth's eyes narrow further, but she did not close the door. "I do not talk about Richard Voss to strangers who show up at my home," she said. "You could be working for him for all I know, trying to find out what I know, or do not know." Ethan pulled out his wallet and showed her his driver's license, then held up his phone with a photograph of his grandmother's barn room, the walls covered with clippings and evidence. "My grandmother was Claire Hayes," he said quietly. "She spent 25 years collecting evidence about what really happened at that mine, and she left it all to me. I found everything, the memos, the witness statements, the proof that Thomas Hayes was murdered. I need to understand what I am up against. And Marla said you were the only person who ever stood up to Voss and survived." The transformation in Beth Corman was immediate and profound, her defensive suspicion dissolving into something that looked like shock, mixed with a desperate, long, dormant hope. She stepped back from the door, opening it wide. "Claire Hayes," she said, her voice suddenly thick with emotion. "Get inside, now, before anyone sees you here." Once inside her small, book-lined cabin, Beth sat across from Ethan at a scarred wooden table and listened as he explained what he had found. And when he finished, she was silent for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly as she poured them both coffee from a battered pot. "I was investigating that collapse for the regional paper in 1992, she finally said. "I was young, ambitious, and I thought I could expose the truth. I found evidence that the collapse was preventable, that multiple warnings had been ignored, and I started to piece together that Thomas Hayes had been trying to shut the mine down before he died. I reached out to Claire, tried to work with her, and she was cautious, but willing to share what she knew. Then Sarah died in that car accident, and Claire vanished. She refused my calls, moved deeper into isolation, and I could not find her anymore. My editor killed the story after Voss's legal team threatened a lawsuit, and I lost my job when I refused to let it go." She looked at Ethan with an intensity that made him sit straighter. "There is one person who was there, who saw what happened, who might be willing to testify if he knew the evidence still existed. His name is Frank Delgado. He was a supervisor at the mine, and he lives in a nursing home in Billings called Evergreen Care. If you want the truth, if you want to build a case that cannot be buried, you need to talk to Frank before it is too late." The drive to Billings took 4 hours through mountain roads that gradually descended into the high plains of eastern Montana, and Ethan used the time to prepare himself for a conversation he knew would be difficult and possibly painful, a meeting with a man who had carried the weight of silence and guilt for 3 decades. The Evergreen Care Facility was a modern, well-maintained building on the outskirts of the city, and when Ethan asked at the front desk to visit Frank Delgado, the nurse gave him a room number and directions down a long, antiseptic hallway that smelled of cleaning products and the peculiar sadness of places where people came to finish their lives. Frank Delgado was sitting in a chair by the window when Ethan knocked softly on the open door, and the old man who turned to look at him was frail in the way of people whose bodies have begun the final surrender, his skin thin and papery, his hands marked with age spots and tremors, but his eyes were clear and sharp, the eyes of someone whose mind had not yielded to time. Ethan entered slowly, respectfully, and introduced himself with words he had rehearsed during the drive, but which still felt strange and weighty on his tongue. "Mr. Delgado, my name is Ethan Hayes. I am Claire Hayes's grandson, and Thomas Hayes's grandson." The effect of those names on the old man was immediate and devastating. Frank's eyes filled with tears that spilled down his weathered cheeks, and he raised one trembling hand to his mouth, as if to hold back a sound of grief that had been building for 30 years. "Thomas's grandson," he whispered, his voice cracked and rough. "Lord, I never thought I would live to see this day. I never thought anyone from that family would come looking for the truth." Ethan pulled a chair close and sat down, giving Frank time to compose himself, and when the old man finally spoke again, his words came in a rush, as if a dam had broken and decades of suppressed testimony were flooding out. He told Ethan about Thomas Hayes, about his integrity and his courage, about how he had been the only safety inspector Voss could not bribe or intimidate. He described how Thomas had discovered discrepancies in the structural reports, how he had conducted his own independent assessment of the mine's condition, and had found that critical support sections were on the verge of catastrophic failure. "Thomas came to me about 3 weeks before he died," Frank said, his gaze distant with memory. "He told me he had proof that Voss had bribed the state mining inspector to falsify the official reports, that there were 2 sets of documents, the real ones showing the mine was a death trap, and the fake ones that made it look safe. He said he had both sets, that he was taking them to federal authorities, and that once the investigation started, Voss would go to prison." Frank's hands clenched into fists. 4 days later, they found Thomas at the bottom of a cliff on Voss's property. Said he fell while hiking. But Thomas was not a hiker. He was afraid of heights, and he had no reason to be on Voss's land. I knew they killed him, but I was too afraid to say anything. Afraid for my job, afraid for my family. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. Then Sarah started asking questions, started collecting evidence of her own, and 3 months later she was dead too. And I knew that anyone who tried to expose the truth would end up the same way. I kept my mouth shut, and 37 good men stayed buried in that mountain without justice. Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Frank, those duplicate reports that Thomas had, do you know what happened to them?" The old man nodded slowly. "Thomas told me he gave them to Claire for safekeeping, said if anything happened to him, she would know what to do with them. If you inherited that farm, son, you inherited more than land." Ethan drove back to the farm, with Frank Delgado's words echoing in his mind, the knowledge that the evidence his grandfather had died protecting might still exist somewhere in the barn room, filling him with a desperate urgency mixed with dread. He arrived as evening shadows were lengthening across the property, and went directly to the barn, not bothering with the farmhouse, moving through the outer structure to the hidden room where he had already spent so many hours absorbing his grandmother's research. This time, however, he approached the space with a different perspective, looking not just at what was visible on the walls and desk, but searching for what might be hidden, for the secret within the secret. He examined the desk more carefully, running his hands along its underside, tapping on the wood, listening for hollow sounds. And that was when he noticed that the bottom drawer, the one that should have extended the full depth of the desk based on its external dimensions, seemed oddly shallow when opened, leaving several inches of space that could not be accounted for. He removed the drawer entirely, setting it aside, and peered into the cavity, his flashlight revealing a thin, horizontal seam in what should have been solid wood. Using his pocket knife, he pried carefully at the seam, until he heard a soft click, and the false bottom of the desk released, tilting upward on hidden hinges to reveal a compartment that had been concealed for decades. Inside was a fireproof document case, the kind used to protect vital papers from disaster, its grey metal surface unmarked except for a small combination lock that secured the latches. Ethan felt a moment of frustration, thinking he would need to force it open and potentially damage whatever was inside. But then he noticed something he had overlooked. Embossed into the metal near the lock were 3 numbers, faint and worn but still visible, a date written in month, day, year format, and when he looked closer he realized it was his birth date, the one piece of information that connected him irrevocably to this place and this history. He spun the combination dial, entering the numbers with trembling fingers, and the lock released with a satisfying click that seemed to echo with significance in the small room. He lifted the lid slowly, almost reverently, and found himself looking at a collection of manila envelopes, each one carefully labelled in his grandfather's precise handwriting, with dates, names, and cryptic reference numbers. One envelope, thicker than the others, and marked with red ink along its edges, bore a label that made Ethan's breath catch. Federal Evidence, 1992, Original Documents. He opened it with hands that shook despite his efforts to remain calm, and spread the contents across the desk under the harsh light of the camping lantern. What he found was nothing less than a complete, irrefutable record of corporate malfeasance and criminal conspiracy. There were 2 sets of structural assessment reports for the mine, identical in format and official appearance, but radically different in content. The first set marked internal use only, detailed severe structural deficiencies in multiple tunnel sections, documented extensive cracking in support beams, and included engineering calculations that predicted catastrophic failure within 6 to 8 months if corrective action was not taken immediately. The second set, bearing the official state seal and submission stamps, presented the same tunnel sections as structurally sound, with only minor maintenance issues that posed no significant safety risk. The falsification was not subtle. It was comprehensive and deliberate, a complete rewriting of reality, designed to keep a dangerous mine operational. Beneath the reports were signed and notarized statements from Thomas Hayes, written in the formal language of official testimony, detailing his discovery of the falsified documents, naming the state inspector who had accepted bribes from Voss Mining, and providing a timeline of his attempts to report the violations through proper channels before deciding to bypass local and state authorities and go directly to federal investigators. This was the evidence that had gotten his grandfather killed, that had gotten his mother murdered, and that his grandmother had spent 25 years protecting while living in isolation and fear. Ethan spent the night in the barn room, unable to return to the farmhouse while the evidence lay exposed on the desk, and he carefully rephotographed every document from the fireproof case before sealing it back in its hiding place. Understanding that these papers were not just historical artifacts, but active threats to a powerful man who had already demonstrated his willingness to kill to protect his secrets. He finally returned to the farmhouse around 2 in the morning, exhausted and overwhelmed by the weight of what he now possessed, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep that was shattered hours later by a smell that triggered every survival instinct he possessed. Smoke, thick and acrid, seeping under the door and through the cracks in the old windows. He jerked awake, disoriented for a moment, and then the reality of the situation crashed down on him with terrifying clarity. Something was burning, and he was in danger. He stumbled to the window and looked out to see the equipment shed, the small outbuilding where he had found the bolt cutters just days earlier, completely engulfed in flames that reached toward the pre-dawn sky like grasping fingers. The dry wood of the structure feeding the fire with a roaring intensity that lit up the entire clearing in flickering orange light. He grabbed his phone and called 911, giving the address and the nature of the emergency, and then he ran outside in his bare feet, the cold ground shocking against his skin, knowing even as he approached that there was nothing he could do. The fire was too advanced, too hot, too consuming. The volunteer fire department arrived 20 minutes later, 3 trucks and a dozen men who worked with practiced efficiency to contain the blaze and prevent it from spreading to the nearby forest. But by the time they had the flames under control, the shed was nothing but a smoking pile of charred timber and twisted metal. The fire chief, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Carson, walked the perimeter of the destruction, with Ethan following, and after a cursory examination that lasted less than 5 minutes, Carson declared it an electrical fire, probably caused by old wiring that had finally given out. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. "There is no electricity running to that shed," he said firmly. "There are no wires, no outlets, nothing that could have caused an electrical fire. Someone set this deliberately." Carson gave him a look that was both sympathetic and dismissive, the expression of someone who had learned not to ask questions that might lead to uncomfortable answers. "These old outbuildings, sometimes there is wiring you do not know about, ran underground decades ago and forgotten. I will file my report as accidental, and your insurance should cover it." He left before Ethan could argue further, and as the fire trucks pulled away, Ethan stood in the grey dawn light, looking at the smouldering ruins and understanding the message that had been delivered with brutal clarity. Voss knew he had not accepted the offer, knew he was still on the property, and the pressure was escalating from threats to action. Walt arrived mid-morning on his ATV, his weathered face grave with concern, and before Ethan could say anything, the old rancher held up a hand. "I know about the fire, saw the smoke from my place. I also need to tell you something, and I am not proud of it. 2 days ago, a man came to my ranch, said he worked for Voss, offered me $5,000 to encourage you to sell, to tell you the property is cursed, to make your life difficult enough that you would want to leave." Walt's jaw tightened. "I told him to get off my land. But Ethan, you need to understand what you are up against. If they are willing to burn your buildings, they are willing to do worse, and nobody in this county is going to help you, because they are all either afraid of Voss or in his pocket." The fire and Walt's warning transformed Ethan's approach from reactive investigation to strategic preparation, and he understood with cold clarity that if he was going to expose Richard Voss, he needed to ensure that the evidence could not be destroyed by another fire or a more direct attack on the property. He spent the next 2 days systematically creating multiple copies of everything from the fireproof case and his grandmother's archive, scanning documents at the local library, making high-resolution photographs with his phone, and organizing the digital files into a comprehensive package that told the complete story from Thomas Hayes's initial discovery through the mining disaster and the cover-up that followed. He drove to a bank in a town 3 counties away, a place where Voss's influence would be diluted if not eliminated entirely, and rented a safe deposit box under his name, storing 1 complete set of physical copies in the secure vault. Another set he delivered personally to Beth Corman, who accepted them with a fierce determination in her eyes, and a promise that she would guard them with her life, and know exactly what to do with them if anything happened to Ethan. The third set he uploaded to multiple secure cloud storage services, encrypted with passwords that he memorized rather than wrote down, creating a digital insurance policy that would survive even if he did not. With the evidence secured, he turned his attention to finding legal representation, someone with the expertise and courage to take on a powerful adversary, and after hours of research and several phone calls, he found himself speaking with Marcus Webb, a lawyer in Denver who specialized in whistleblower cases and wrongful death lawsuits, and who had a reputation for taking on corporations and winning. Webb agreed to review the evidence remotely, and Ethan spent an entire evening uploading files and sending encrypted emails, then waited anxiously for the lawyer's assessment. The call came the next morning, and Webb's voice carried a mixture of excitement and concern that immediately put Ethan on edge. "What you have here is extraordinary," Webb said without preamble. "This is not just evidence of negligence or regulatory violations. This is proof of criminal conspiracy, bribery of public officials, falsification of federal documents, and potentially multiple homicides committed to cover up those crimes. If we can get this before a federal prosecutor who is willing to act, Richard Voss will face criminal charges that could put him in prison for the rest of his life, and even after 30 years, there is no statute of limitations on murder. The families of those miners would also have grounds for wrongful death lawsuits that could bankrupt his entire operation." He paused, and his tone grew more serious. "But Ethan, you need to understand what you are walking into. Voss has spent 3 decades building power and influence. He has resources you cannot imagine, and he has already demonstrated that he is willing to kill to protect his secrets. This will not be a quick or easy battle. He will use every legal tactic available to delay, to discredit, to exhaust your resources and your will. He will come after you personally, professionally, financially. You need to be prepared for a fight that could take years and that will put you in real physical danger." Webb let that sink in before continuing. "My strongest advice is that you go to the FBI immediately, today if possible. Do not go to local law enforcement, because we cannot trust that they are not compromised. Contact the FBI field office in Helena. Ask to speak with someone in their public corruption unit, and turn over everything you have. Let the federal government take the lead on the criminal investigation while we prepare the civil cases." Ethan was preparing to drive to Helena to meet with the FBI field office, his truck packed with copies of the evidence, and Marcus Webb's contact information programmed into his phone, when he heard the sound of vehicles approaching the property. Not the single engine of Walt's ATV, or even Voss's luxury SUV, but multiple vehicles moving in formation, and when he looked out the window, his stomach dropped with a sickening sense of inevitability. 3 county sheriff's department cruisers pulled up to the farmhouse, lights flashing, but sirens silent, and 6 officers emerged with the coordinated movements of a tactical team executing a planned operation. The sheriff himself, a thick-necked man in his 50s, named Daniels, whom Ethan had never met, approached the door with a folded paper in his hand and an expression of professional neutrality that did not reach his cold eyes. Ethan opened the door before they could knock, and Daniels held up the paper without preamble. "Ethan Hayes, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of arson and criminal trespassing. You have the right to remain silent." The words continued in the familiar cadence of Miranda rights, but Ethan barely heard them over the roaring in his ears as the implications crashed down on him. He was allowed to grab a jacket before his hands were cuffed behind his back, the metal cold and tight against his wrists, and he was placed in the back of a cruiser, while other officers entered his farmhouse and began what they called a search for evidence. At the county jail, a small facility attached to the courthouse, Ethan was processed with bureaucratic efficiency, fingerprinted, photographed, his belongings inventoried, and sealed in a plastic bag. The charges were read to him formally: arson of his own property, with intent to collect insurance money, a felony, and criminal trespassing on private property, specifically Richard Voss's ranch the previous week, a misdemeanor that carried additional penalties because the property owner had filed a complaint. Both charges were complete fabrications. Ethan had never filed an insurance claim and had never set foot on Voss's property. But he understood with bitter clarity the truth was irrelevant when the sheriff was in Voss's pocket, and the entire system was designed to protect power rather than pursue justice. Sitting in the small holding cell, his mind raced through the strategic implications of his arrest, and he realized this was Voss's play. Isolate him, remove him from the property, discredit him as a criminal and insurance fraudster, so that when he eventually tried to present his evidence, no one would believe him. More importantly, while he sat locked in this cell, unable to protect the barn or intervene, Voss's people would be searching the property, looking for the evidence they knew must exist somewhere. Beth Corman, whose network of contacts in the community was more extensive than Ethan had realized, heard about the arrest within 2 hours and immediately called Marcus Webb in Denver, who sprang into action with the focused intensity of someone who had fought these battles before. Webb filed emergency motions, called in favors from judges he had worked with, and made it clear that his client was being held on fabricated charges as part of a conspiracy to prevent him from reporting evidence of federal crimes. 18 hours after his arrest, Ethan was released on bail that Webb had arranged through a bondsman, and he walked out of the jail into the grey afternoon light, feeling bruised and exhausted, but grimly determined. When he finally returned to the farm, driving fast on the rutted road with his heart pounding, he found exactly what he had feared. The barn doors stood open, and inside, his grandmother's carefully organized archive had been torn apart, papers scattered across the floor, cork boards ripped from the walls, the desk overturned and its drawers smashed open, a scene of deliberate, thorough destruction. Ethan stood in the ransacked barn room, his initial rage at the destruction giving way to a cold, calculating assessment of what had actually happened, and as he examined the overturned desk and the smashed false bottom compartment, he felt a grim satisfaction rather than despair, because the fireproof case was gone, not stolen, but already removed by him days earlier, when he had distributed copies to safe locations. The intruders had found the hiding place, but had found it empty, and their frustration was evident in the excessive destruction, the way they had torn apart everything, looking for what was no longer there. He returned to the farmhouse as darkness fell, moving through rooms that felt violated and unsafe, and it was while he was checking the windows and doors, operating on the hyper-vigilant instincts of someone who had learned to be watchful, that he noticed something out of place. A small black object, no larger than a button, tucked into the gap between the kitchen cabinet and the wall, positioned with a clear line of sight to the table where he had been working and making phone calls. His hand froze halfway to touching it as recognition flooded through him. It was a listening device, sophisticated and professional, the kind used by security firms and private investigators, and it meant that every conversation he had held in this house, every phone call to Marcus Webb, every discussion with Beth Corman had been monitored by Voss or his people. The violation was profound, the knowledge that his words and plans had been transmitted to his enemy. But as Ethan stared at the tiny device, an idea began to form, dangerous and audacious, but potentially perfect. If Voss had been listening, if he believed he knew Ethan's plans and strategies, then that listening device could become a weapon rather than a vulnerability, a channel through which Ethan could feed false information and manipulate his adversary into making a mistake. He left the device exactly where it was, undisturbed, and spent the next hour carefully planning what he would say and how he would say it, understanding that his performance had to be convincing, had to sound like genuine defeat and capitulation rather than the calculated theater it actually was. Finally, he sat at the kitchen table, positioned himself clearly within range of the listening device, and called Marcus Webb on his cell phone. And when the lawyer answered, Ethan spoke in a voice that he made sound tired, defeated, and resigned to an outcome he could not change. "Marcus, I have been thinking about everything that has happened, the arrest, the destruction of the barn, the fire, and I have come to a decision. I cannot do this. I cannot fight someone with Voss's resources and power. I am 24 years old. I have no money, no support, and I am exhausted." He paused, letting the silence stretch, knowing that whoever was monitoring the device would be leaning forward, listening intently. "Voss has made me a new offer through an intermediary, $750,000, and I am going to accept it. I know you think I should fight, but I need you to draw up the paperwork for the sale. There is going to be a meeting here at the farm in 2 days, at noon, and I am going to bring all the original documents, everything from my grandmother's archive, the reports, the witness statements, everything, and I am going to hand them over as part of the sale agreement. It is over, Marcus. I just want to take the money and start over somewhere else." Webb, who had been briefed by text message about the listening device and understood his role in this performance, played his part perfectly, arguing and objecting with convincing passion, but Ethan remained firm, and the call ended with his apparent capitulation complete and his trap set. While Ethan had been staging his performance for the listening device, Marcus Webb and Beth Corman had been working through different channels, contacting the FBI field office in Helena and presenting a preliminary summary of the evidence, along with affidavits from Frank Delgado and a detailed timeline of the harassment and intimidation Ethan had faced. The federal agents, recognizing the potential significance of a case involving multiple homicides, corporate fraud, and bribery of state officials, had moved with surprising speed, assigning a team to review the evidence and conducting preliminary interviews that confirmed the basic facts. When Webb informed them of Ethan's plan to draw Voss into the open through the listening device, they agreed to position agents on the property in concealment, turning Ethan's farm into a carefully orchestrated trap. The morning of the meeting arrived cold and bright, and Ethan moved through the motions of preparation with a strange calm, knowing that federal agents were already in position in the forest surrounding the property, dressed in camouflage and equipped with cameras and recording equipment. At precisely noon, Richard Voss's convoy arrived with arrogance. 3 vehicles, the luxury SUV flanked by 2 trucks carrying men who looked like private security contractors. Voss emerged wearing an expensive suit and a smile of cold satisfaction. "I knew you would see reason eventually," Voss said with condescension. "Your grandmother was stubborn to the point of insanity, but you are smarter." Ethan led him into the barn, and in the dim interior, he picked up a folder from the overturned desk. "Everything is here," Ethan said quietly, extending the folder toward Voss. Voss snatched it eagerly and opened it, his expression transforming from triumph to dawning horror as he realized he was looking at copies, not originals, with a note reading, "The originals are with the FBI." Before he could react, the barn doors opened and a voice cut through the air. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nobody move." Agents emerged from concealment surrounding the entire property, and Richard Voss was placed in handcuffs and arrested for fraud, bribery, conspiracy, and 2 counts of murder. The weeks following Richard Voss's arrest were a whirlwind of FBI interviews, document reviews, and the slow, methodical unraveling of a conspiracy that had lasted 3 decades. Ethan found himself at the center of it all, giving testimony that lasted for hours, providing context for the evidence his grandmother had collected, and watching as federal prosecutors built a case so comprehensive and damning that even Voss's expensive legal team could offer no meaningful defense. The FBI's forensic accounting team discovered that Richard Voss had built his empire through a systematic pattern of cutting corners, bribing officials, and eliminating anyone who threatened to expose his methods. Thomas Hayes had been murdered, his death carefully staged to look like an accidental fall, by men Voss had hired through intermediaries that created layers of deniability. Sarah Hayes's car accident had been even more carefully orchestrated, the FBI finding evidence of a payment made to a mechanic who had access to her vehicle the day before her death, her brake lines cut or sabotaged to silence a young woman preparing to testify about her husband's murder. Claire Hayes had lived for 25 years in a prison of fear and isolation, sacrificing everything, including her relationship with her only grandson, because she understood that Voss would use any connection to force her silence or eliminate the evidence she had preserved. The investigation also uncovered a web of corruption that extended far beyond the mining disaster itself. County officials who had received regular payments, state inspectors who had falsified reports, and even a federal administrator who had buried complaints in exchange for campaign contributions. But among all the revelations, the one that affected Ethan most profoundly came from Marcus Webb, who presented him with bank records showing anonymous donations made to the state orphanage where Ethan had spent his childhood, payments that had funded special programs and educational opportunities he had benefited from without knowing their source, revealing a grandmother who had loved him from a distance with invisible dedication. Spring arrived in Montana with a gentleness that felt like forgiveness, the snow melting away to reveal earth ready to begin again, and Ethan stood in front of the barn on a warm April morning, watching as the last touches were completed on repairs that had transformed the structure from a vessel of secrets into something that honored the past while embracing the future. The small interior room, where his grandmother had spent years building her case against injustice, had undergone the most profound transformation. Working with Beth Corman's guidance, and with contributions from the families of the miners who had died in the collapse, Ethan had converted the room into a memorial. The walls now displayed carefully curated photographs: Thomas Hayes in his safety inspector's uniform, Sarah Hayes holding infant Ethan, and Claire Hayes standing protectively in front of the barn. Beside these were framed newspaper articles documenting the resolution of the case, headlines proclaiming justice finally served. On a simple wooden table lay a letter under glass, written by the families of the 37 miners, thanking him for having the courage to finish what his grandmother had started. Ethan had decided to stay, and the farm was slowly being restored to functionality, with help from Walt, who had become a mentor and friend, teaching him about the land and mountain agriculture. He had enrolled in an agricultural program at the regional college, studying soil management and sustainable farming practices. Beth Corman visited regularly, working on a comprehensive book about the case, about corruption in rural America, about the cost of silence and the power of one person's determination to preserve truth. As Ethan looked out over the land that stretched toward the distant mountains, land his grandmother had protected for 25 years, at tremendous personal cost, he finally understood that she had not abandoned him out of rejection, but out of love so profound it had required her to give him up to keep him safe. He was no longer the unwanted orphan. He was home,